The Battle of Tannenberg was fought between Russia and Germany from August 26 to August 30, 1914, during the first month of World War I. The battle resulted in the almost complete destruction of the Russian Second Army and the suicide of its commanding general, Alexander Samsonov. A series of follow-up battles destroyed most of the First Army as well and kept the Russians off balance until the spring of 1915. The battle is particularly notable for fast rail movements by the Germans, enabling them to concentrate against each of the two Russian armies in turn, and also for the failure of the Russians to encode their radio messages. It brought high prestige to Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his rising staff officer Erich Ludendorff. Although the battle actually took place near Allenstein, Hindenburg named it after Tannenberg, 30 kilometers to the west, to avenge the defeat of the Teutonic Knights at the earlier battle of that name in 1410. Background: the French war plan was to attack as soon as their army was mobilized to drive the Germans from Alsace and Lorraine. If the British joined as promised, they would become the left flank. Their Russian allies would have a massive army, more than 95 divisions, but their mobilization would inevitably be somewhat slower. Getting their men to the war front would also be delayed because their railway network was far behind Western European standards. For instance, three-quarters was still single-tracked. They intended to have 27 divisions at the front by day 15 and 52 by day 23, but it would take 60 days before 90 divisions were in action. Despite their difficulties, the Russians promised the French that they would promptly engage the armies of Austria-Hungary in the south and on day 15, would invade German East Prussia. East Prussia was a vulnerable salient thrust into Russian territory, extending from the Vistula River in the west to the border with Lithuania in the east, a distance of roughly 190 kilometers. On the north was the Baltic and on the south was the border with Poland. It was about 130 kilometers wide. Somewhat east of the center of the province was the heavily fortified peninsula on which its capital Königsberg was located. The Russians would rely on two of their three railways that ran up to the border. Each would provision an army. The railways ended at the border. As for defensive reasons, Russian trains operated on a different rail gauge than Western Europe. Consequently, their armies could only be transported by rail as far as the German border and could only use Prussian railways with captured locomotives and rolling stock. The First Army would use the line that ran from Vilnius, Lithuania to the border 136 kilometers southeast of Königsberg. The Second Army Railway ran from Warsaw, Poland to the border 165 kilometers southwest of Königsberg. The two armies would take the Germans in pinces. The Russian supply chains would be ungainly because, again for defense, on their side of the border there were only a few sandy tracks rather than proper macadamized roads. Adding to their supply problems, they deployed large numbers of cavalry and Cossacks. Every day each horse needed 10 times the resources that a man required. The First Army commander was General Pavel Karlovich Rennenkampf, who in the Russo-Japanese War had earned a reputation for exceptional energy, determination, courage, and military capability. The Second Army, coming north from Warsaw, was under General Alexander Vasilovich Samsonov, who was possessed of a brilliant mind, reinforced by an excellent military education. Since commanding a division in the war with Japan, he had been governor of Turkestan. The two armies were directed by the military governor of Warsaw, who in wartime commanded the Northwest Military District, General Yakov Grigorovich Zielinski. His duties in Manchuria had been more diplomatic than military. Before moving to Warsaw, he had been chief of the Russian General Staff for 2 years. He set up his headquarters in Volkovisk, about 410 kilometers from Königsberg. Communications would be a daunting challenge. Their supply of cable was insufficient to run telephone or telegraph connections from the rear. All they had was needed for field communications. Therefore, they relied on mobile wireless stations, which would link Zelensky to his two army commanders and with all corps commanders. The Russians were aware that the Germans had broken their ciphers, but they continued to use them until war broke out. A new code was ready, but they were still very short of the code books. Zelensky and Rennenkampf each had one. Samsonov did not. Hence many messages were sent in the clear, hoping that they would not be intercepted. The Germans also used wireless during their invasions of Belgium and France. The German Schlieffen Plan proposed to defeat France swiftly while the Russians were mobilizing. Then Germany's armies would shift by train to the Eastern Front. Therefore, East Prussia was garrisoned by a single army, the 8th, commanded by General Maximilian von Prittwitz und Gaffron, which was to hold back the Russians while the outcome in the west was decided. A tangle of lakes, marshes and dense woods characterized the province, which would help defenders. When the war began, the bulk of the German 8th Army was southwest of Königsberg, ready to defend either the western or the southern frontier. 485,000 Russians were facing 173,000 Germans. More than half of the men in both armies just had been mobilized, so many were not yet fighting fit. Prelude. 17 to 22 August. Rennenkampf's First Army crossed the frontier on 17 August 1914, moving westward slowly. This was sooner than the Germans anticipated, because the Russian mobilization, including the Baltic and Warsaw districts, had begun secretly on 25 July, not with the Tsar's proclamation on 30 July. They were attacked at Stallupönen by a division of the German First Corps under Lieutenant General Hermann von François. The Russians were driven back and lost 3,000 men as prisoners, but First Corps was ordered by Prittwitz, who had not authorized the attack, to pull back to Gumbinnen to concentrate his forces. The Russian advance continued on the afternoon of 18 August and on the following day. Prittwitz attacked near Gumbinnen on 20 August, when he knew from intercepted wireless messages that Rennenkampf's infantry was resting. German First Corps was on their left. 17th Corps commanded by Lieutenant General Gus von Mackensen in the center and 1st Reserve Corps led by General Otto von Below on the right. A night march enabled one of François's divisions to hit the Russian 20th Corps right flank at 400. Rennenkampf's men rallied to stoutly resist the attack. Their artillery was devastating until they ran out of ammunition, then the Russians retired. First Corps attacks were halted at 1600 to rest men sapped by the torrid summer heat. François was sure they could win the next day. On his left, Mackensen's 17th Corps launched a vigorous frontal attack, but the Russian infantry held firm. That afternoon the Russian heavy artillery struck back. The German infantry fled in panic. Their artillery limbered up and joined the stampede. Prittwitz ordered First Corps and 1st Reserve Corps to break off the action and retreat also. At noon he had telephoned Field Marshal von Moltke at Hull to report that all was going well. That evening he telephoned again to report disaster. His problems were compounded because an intercepted wireless message disclosed that the Russian II Army included 5 corps and a cavalry division, and aerial scouts saw their columns marching across the frontier. They were opposed by a single reinforced German corps, the XX, commanded by Lieutenant General Friedrich von Schultz. At 2023, 8th Army telegraphed told that they would withdraw to West Prussia. However, the next morning, the 21st of August, 8th Army staff realized that because Samsonov's II Army was closer to the Vistula crossings, they must relocate most of their forces to join with 20th Corps to block Samsonov before they could withdraw further. Now Moltke was told that they would only retreat a short way. François protested directly to the Kaiser about his panicking superiors. That evening Prittwitz reported that the German 1st Cavalry Division had disappeared. His next call disclosed that they had ridden in with 500 prisoners. Probably Moltke had already decided to replace both Prittwitz and his highly regarded Chief of Staff Major General Alfred von Waldersee. On the morning of the 22nd of August, their replacements, Colonel General Paul von Hindenburg and Major General Erich Ludendorff, were notified of their new assignments. The Eighth Army issued the orders to move towards Samsonov's Second Army. First Corps was closest to the railway, so it would move by train to support the right of 20th Corps, while the other two German corps would march the shorter distance to 20th Corps left. The 1st Cavalry Division with some older garrison troops would remain to screen Rennenkampf. On the afternoon of the 22nd of August, the head of the 8th Army Field Railways was informed by telegraph that new commanders were coming by special train. The telegram relieving their former commanders came later. First Corps was moving over more than 150 kilometers of rail, day and night, one train every 30 minutes, with 25 minutes to unload instead of the customary hour or two. After the battle at Gumbinnen, Rennenkampf decided to keep his First Army in position to resupply and to be in good positions if the Germans attacked. Again, both Russian armies were having serious supply problems. Everything had to be carted up from the railheads because they could not use the East Prussian railway track, and many units were hampered by lack of field bakeries, ammunition carts, and the like. The Second Army also was hampered by incompetent staff work and poor communications. Poor staff work not only exacerbated supply problems but, more importantly, caused Samsonov during the fighting to lose operational control over all but the two corps in his immediate vicinity.